Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Regulation Navigation with Warren Miller, brought to you by ITS. This is our fourth informational session in a series centered around various regulation-related topics that cover basics and give an opportunity for you to learn something new today, validate what you already know, or get answers to a question you may have. Today, we are diving into the topic of integrity management. What is it? How did it become regulation? And a few initial considerations for implementing such a program. Hi, I'm Chris Taylor, the Creative Director here at ITS to facilitate this discussion. With me is ITS Regulatory Compliance Specialist Warren Miller and ITS Director of Compliance Lenny Kimball. Warren has an extensive experience as a former regulator with the Department of Transportation Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, and Lenny also has a wealth of experience with integrity management, formerly working for a major natural gas transmission and distribution company for much of his career. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping to ensure this experience is beneficial for all of you. This session will be recorded. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please submit those in the chat box. We'll have time at the end of the discussion for Warren and Lenny to answer your questions. And if we're unable to answer your question during the session, we'll follow up afterwards. And just a gentle reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar series should not be utilized as your only source of information. We're going to start out with a general history of integrity management and how it became regulation. We'll then discuss at a high level how integrity management is applied for hazardous liquids, gas transmission, and gas distribution. And finally, we'll touch on the development of an integrity management plan and change management from the perspective of an operator. So without further ado, let's get started. The origin of how integrity management became required by regulation provides a good basis of contextual background for what it is today. Warren, can you kick us off with this discussion and share what the industry was like before integrity management requirements were introduced? How were inspections conducted? Warren, you're on mute.
Already technical difficulties. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Inspections were done most of the times in the regulatory area, whether it was cathodic protections, operation and maintenance, drug and alcohol. They were very specific and addressed asking an operator, okay, did you get this done? Valve inspection, things like that. So many of the inspection forms, if you were around at that time, were checking the boxes. Did you do your valve inspections? Check. Did you get them done in the right time? Check. On to the next thing, leak surveys, anything that had regulatory requirements, it was a check off. And that's how the inspections were done. That's how everybody was graded. Larger companies, well, even smaller companies, had siloed programs that didn't interact with each other. So cathodic protection or corrosion group didn't talk to overpressure, didn't talk to public awareness. Of course, public awareness wasn't then. And then, as we've seen, and regulations have been put into place to require operators to find out about their pipe. So actually knowing their specs or verifying what pipe they have in the ground. Many operators didn't have mapping, certainly no GIS back then. Just had started with CAD back in the early 90s, and so you can see the progression of information that's now gathered on new construction. And then another big thing that has affected pipelines, but nobody really tracked it other than class location studies, was growth and encroachment. As liquid has no class location studies, they actually weren't tracking just how people were coming into their areas near their pipeline.
I see. So it's really tracked along with advances in technology. As with most regulations, there's usually a cause or a turning point that creates a need for change. Warren, was there a specific incident, or how did integrity management come to be required?
It came off of a number of pipeline ruptures. We had Bellingham, we had Simpsonville in South Carolina, Ruston, Virginia, and Edison, New Jersey. Again, liquid and gas. And so NTSB and Congress actually started wanting to know what PHMSA or RISPA was doing at the time to address the issues, and they laid out some very specific things. And so one of the things that had to be done, they were looking to see how data was integrated. And there was actually a precursor to integrity management was SII, and it was done in the late 90s. And so it was kind of a pilot program to see how companies were actually integrating that data and looking at those threats. So sorry, I just minimized the wrong.
It's all right.
There we go. Just a second. I apologize.
No worries. We all have computer issues from now on.
All right, just 1 second here. Wanted to integrate the process to assess the programs across the board and integrate data. So if you had cathodic protection issues, was that being told to somebody else in another side of operations? Also, the definition of high consequence areas was introduced to the pipeline world. And so they had to look at it both on the liquid side and the gas side. And of course, now medium consequence areas have been addressed these last couple of years. They needed to plan to see how a failure would actually, what the consequences were along a pipeline right away in an HCA. An operator had to look at it and decide, okay, here's what we've got to do to address this risk. And then it also required that everybody, hazardous liquid, gas transmission, and gas distribution, develop plans to develop the plans, implement them, and then always be looking for continuous improvement after they were put together.
It makes sense. It's one thing that I like that really stands out to me. It's an integrated process of information sharing and threat assessment. I mean, really, that's the crux of what integrity management is.
Correct.
Warren, you've mentioned that integrity management, that the requirement was unprecedented in a few ways. You mentioned this to me in passing. What are some of those?
Well, probably the biggest one that was new to everybody was the leadership buy-in. So it actually, by regulation, requires that executives, whether it's vice president, CEO, whoever, actually sign off and say, yep, I'm involved in this. So I'm going to provide resources. I'm going to provide my support by, telling my company, this is what we're going to do. Because when things are driven from the top down, typically it's held better in operations, whether it's a safety program or integrity management in this case. And again, the continuous improvement. After you've built something, it's taking a look at it. Was it kind of a program effectiveness as such to make sure that it's effective, and if it wasn't effective, take care of that. But is there another way you can make it even better? And continuous improvement 10 years later, 15 years later, operators couldn't fathom, how do we get better, especially in an industry across the country that there aren't a lot of incidents and accidents. And so trying to see how do we get better at being at, the smaller amount of accidents compared to other industries wasn't ever probably on anybody's radar. And then again, looking at the risks and trying to assess threats and having to go back each year or every 2 years to say, okay, have our risks changed? How are we going to handle those threats? And then how do we assess our pipeline in accordance with those threats? So those three things are probably the biggest points of differentiation. And integrity management, instead of just asking, did you inspect that valve? They ask now, how did you inspect that valve? So it was having the processes and the inspectors looking at those processes.
Yeah. Wow. So that's incredible. Like that it was unprecedented, but to me, it's so interesting because a pipeline, you almost in one sense think it's this thing that you put in the ground. It's always going to be the same, but it's not. It's a living system that changes, that is affected by geology and humans and what's running through the pipeline itself. So and it makes sense that you need to continuously measure, monitor, and react to that. So why did PHMSA choose to begin creating regulation for hazardous liquids versus gas transmission and gas distribution? Why was hazardous liquids first?
In the time frame back in the 90s, liquid lines had some pretty good spills. So larger headlines had been on that, and certainly the cost for remediation of a liquid line spill versus a gas transmission, if it opens up, you've got typically just damage, whereas a remediation to remove tons of dirt, drives cost higher. So if you're looking at dollar per incident, the liquid lines had the majority of that. And at the current way society was, the liquids were catching more environmental flack than natural gas was, since natural gas doesn't affect it. And again, there was other stakeholders and interest groups such as Congress, NTSB, and then and other public. There's other public stakeholders that were also actively involved, pushing PHMSA and pushing Congress to make some changes. And originally the liquid was mainly for operators that were over 500 miles long. The first, when it came out in May 29th of 2001, it required them all to have a plan. But then shortly after, less than a year, it was made applicable to all owners. So everybody that had a liquid pipeline under jurisdiction of PHMSA was required to have a plan. It was phased in according to their size. And if you look at the timeline, operators were given after the first one from March 2002, which was 9 months to implement, develop and implement that first stage of that plan, and then a year for all the other operators. So this was a fast track considering the enormity of this program and what all it entailed. And that'll be some of the information that we'll get to talk about here a little bit later.
Yeah, that sounds like a really quick turnaround to get those programs off the ground.
It is.
How did gas transmission and distribution come to be? Which came first?
The gas transmission did, and actually it was in development before the total implementation of the liquid rule was in place. And again, driven by the NTSB and Congress. There was, dockets that were out there that were pushing for both. And again, I think part of it being that gas or liquid only was 250 to 275,000 miles, and the gas was going to affect much more, 2 million plus between transmission and distribution. And then, of course, the thing with the gas transmission, it applies to all operators that have a transmission pipeline that are under 192. And of course, it came out in February 14th, 2004. Happy Valentine's Day. And they were given 10 months to write and implement their programs. So again, here is these large programs that are being pushed. I know PHMSA had hoped to have longer implementation periods, but it was driven politically to have them occur much faster.
Okay. Yeah, with love from PHMSA, right? The Valentine's Day effective. So how about gas distribution? When did that come into regulation?
Gas distribution came on a little bit later. One of the things is it's quite a different program, because you're talking about intrastate programs. A lot of them are very defined areas. Mm-hmm. And but again, Congress and the other stakeholders wanted to say, okay, if there's similarities between gas distribution and the other pipelines, we want to make sure that folks are looking at that. So 2010 is when this rule came into effect, which was about 6 years later than the transmission. But then also they were given 15 months or 16 months to write and implement theirs. Again, thousands of operators. But these are folks that probably don't have little of any resources to put some type of program together. It wasn't nearly as large, but it did require them to, come up with some way of assessing their program and making sure that they, looking at the threats also.
Warren, you mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation, as regulators imposed the implementation of these programs, regulatory inspections at that time mostly consisted of checking the boxes, just verifying that the program was in place. But what came next?
Well, it was the integration of data. Certainly that trying to get information between the two, between the multiple departments and sharing of that data.
So they were really looking into that, like asking questions of, hey, you have this value over here, and what about this group? And then making sure that they really are in sync, they're talking to one another. That was kind of the next level of checks. It'd
just be like if internal corrosion was found in a pipe, okay, that's in the corrosion department, okay, they've got this issue. Did they check with procurement or somewhere and say, okay, has our source of gas changed, that we're actually getting corrosive gas, or is something else occurring? And if you don't share that information, nobody thinks to say, okay, it's just occurring. Same way as if you had class location change, and somebody not saying, okay, well, we've got damage prevention here. There's a possibility if our damages could go up with all of this encroachment here. Do we need to have more signage? Do we need to have strengthen our public awareness program? And that's the integration of data that PHMSA was looking for operators to put together. And again, it was very foreign to most pipeline operators, because most of them have these little departments, and just the way it was, there were little kingdoms, and a lot of people didn't want to share just because that was what kept them going.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, I kind of led with the context of the history of the programs. Really do, I mean, it's valuable information to understand what the programs are today, where they came from, and I'm sure a number of operators, still are somewhere in between, and a number of regulators are somewhere in between. Lenny, from your experience as an operator, where you have experience implementing and managing integrity management programs, can you share with us how you began to develop and implement the integrity management plan when it became a requirement?
Yeah, you bet. And again, I wasn't in charge of any of this by any means. This was all started by upper management. I just was able to assist and work on parts of this going forward, because it takes a large team to do this. But It kind of goes back to what Warren was saying earlier, that upper management has to have that buy-in. They have to be the support. And they actually, for us, we had a great management team. They put together a new compliance department, put in a new individual to head that department, which was an engineer that had some very good background in steel works and corrosion and other items. But they put that together, and the new team that they put together for this group, especially on the IM side, was some engineers, all of their corrosion specialists that were in the company, some project managers were, in and out. Then, of course, you had to have technical writers. You had to have all kinds of other types of support people for that department and that group. And then inside that department, of course, they were joined by, the OQ compliance team, which is the team I was with. We had our standard practice, or our SOP management team, public awareness teams, emergency plan team, and committee, and so on. All of these groups had to come together. We had drafters, we had all kinds of groups that were part of this and supported this plan and this department specifically. But there was a lot of work to it, and these individuals put in, I can't even tell you how many hours. And the fact that they started not from zero, so to speak, but to gather everything together and to put it together they did was highly commended. And I've had the opportunity to work with other operators, throughout the years, and especially over the last couple of years, working with their plans and looking at them, and everyone's in the same boat now. Some of these operators, of course, are a lot smaller, have fewer resources, but they're still they still have these regulations, and it's tough for everyone. But to start out, we had to decide which type of method of assessment we were going to use for identifying these HCAs, and then what we were going to do with that going forward. And we needed a continuous improvement program, like Warren said, a management of change program. And of course, when we talk about the plan development, this was ongoing. This wasn't just back in the early 2000s, it's been continual. But then also we needed a record retention plan, quality assurance, and then a communication type plan, how we were going to communicate this out to everyone. And then that was kind of where we started, and then it was ongoing to the point where we were going to go into how they were going to run the ILIs. Your inline inspections, what was going to be involved with that, because Warren talked a lot about threat identification and management, but then when you get into looking at the pipe, and then you get risk assessment, and then those dangers and what you do with that. And then, so part of that was getting the ILI set up and the scheduling and going off of what tables, were made available by PHMSA. Pressure testing is something that came out where you needed to know what these pipes were tested at, pipes and valves and everything else involved, because you're not just talking about the pipeline, but meter stations, especially these gate stations and that were all involved. So you had to pressure test them or have records of how they were pressure tested, how they came up with the MAOP for that pipe. But that if they didn't have the records, you had to go back and start from scratch. You had to repressurize these pipelines, or these segments of pipelines, and retest them and put those in your records. But you had to start with a baseline, assessment, and then you had to go with risk management going forward with that, and direct assessments going forward. But there was just a lot of it. You also had to show that you were going to be continually monitoring all of this, and especially if you had identified any risks, how you were going to monitor those risks going forward and what you were going to do with it. Engineering, honestly, engineering was the backbone of the whole thing, of course. And for our company, they did an outstanding job, but they did the bulk of the lifting to get everything organized, to get the records pulled together, because they're there was a lot to it. And then when you get into this bottom bullet here, this proving competent workforce and continuous education, there are parts of that as well where you need to make sure everyone's trained as to what to look for and how to assess things. But over and above that, you had to show that you had supervisory personnel that were trained. You had integrity management specialists or those that were out doing assessments, that they knew what they were doing. They were trained correctly. Sometimes that required certification. Same thing with those that were reading the data that came in from those assessments. You had to have someone along those lines that knew what they were doing, and you had to show that they were continually being educated and up to date. But that's kind of it for that point right there, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like highly technical, cross-functional teams had to be brought together to form a almost like an operational brain, if you will, to constantly, a nervous system, to constantly monitor and adjust and react. That was very vivid kind of detail there of how you came, or how your company came to have an integrity management program. So as your company integrated these cross-departmental teams, how did you keep the information sharing flowing? Can you tell us a little bit, like, how did that work? How is it ensured that silos were broken down as opposed to reformed over time?
Again, it starts with upper management. If you got that support and everyone else in the company sees that support and the importance of it, that it's something that's not going away. It's not just compliance, it's safety and everything else. It's a lot easier to do. And then you put it in the plan, how you're going to bring everything together, how often you're going to meet and talk about it, retrain everyone. Because there's a lot that goes along with that, as well. Have regular meetings with your committee, your plan committee, make sure that you're meeting at least once a year or twice a year for that and going over the plan for any changes or anything. And then these cross committees, like I was talking about earlier, where you cross with public awareness or any of these others, how does that tie in? Are we getting information out to, landowners or these excavators or, things like that? And then making sure that on top of that, everyone that's involved with touching a rectifier out in the field, that they know what they're doing, they know how to read it and work on it. And then these watchdogs and that are bringing the information in and monitoring. It goes to your gas control or your control room. There's just a lot to it, but it all starts with that support from management and then being organized and keeping everyone in the loop continuously and keeping that communication going. When I talk about these work order packets, work order packets weren't a new thing. When a job's created, there's a packet that's put together, but the information that went into that packet changed with this. What information was kept in there, what was stored, who was on site, what happened, what pressures were used, the welding. You had to keep records of, of course, of all of your welders, their certifications, your x-rays and so on. But all of that has to be kept and moved into a central place. And that's where we've got this bottom bullet. And we'll talk more about it, but bringing all that information into a place where the IM group and the compliance department knew where that was, and they could maintain it, watch it, keep it clean and ready to use and available, and also in a way that other departments could access it, upper management could access it and see what was going on with the updates and so on.
So one key, we repeated this a few times, and it's the buy-in for management. But then what stood out to me was the centralizing and making accessible that information and making sure it's understandable at all the levels. Like, that's key to some of the information flow. So let's
because you've got to. Sorry, Chris, but you've got to have these documents done in a way, and our company did a great job of this. done in a way that everyone in the field can understand what they're reading, or anyone else that reads these standards, or anything that it's applicable, that it has to do with the current tools being used and processes. But yeah, and you're spot on with that.
So let's drill into some of the challenges you face, like some of the specific challenges. Let's start with record gathering. What was the biggest challenge with the gathering of the information?
The tough part is, you're supposed to maintain these records for the life of the pipe. Some of these records were stored in different states, in different offices, different engineering groups. So getting those all gathered together again and putting them in one site, that is a heavy lift. And again, when you're pulling that in, you've got to have people that can read it and know that that's applicable and it needs to be saved and where it should be placed and that. So there was a lot of help from other departments as far as scanning documents, creating PDFs so that they could be stored together in these packets and folders. And then making sure that we knew what the record retention rates were for all of these documents, and that everyone else knew that, so things weren't deleted or done away with. But one of the heaviest lifts was getting it from paper to digital, and then having that stored in redundant states, in case there was any incidents or anything like that. And then time and resources is huge. And for a regulated company, that's not always easy, to be able to find that money to have the resources and the workforce and the time to do that. It was a challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. Just around the digitization of, or I get, this is something I could see it's definitely been impacted by technology. Aside from the advances in measurement technology, et cetera, but just document and information sharing, et cetera, that's changing all the time. And I'm wondering, did in the course of your tenure as you were part of this, did you see, what did that look like? Was it from, scanning, you mentioned scanning and digitization in that regard, but did you see a lot of changes as, information was essentially inputted in real time into these systems? And tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we pulled in a lot of different types of applications, created our own Excel spreadsheets, gave tablets to people in the field to enter these forms and documents. But yeah, a lot of it was real time. But then again, when you pull in files off of an ILI, off these machines, they're gigantic data files. So again, there's a lot to do with that, but kind of where it started, when we would go through the old vaults, I'm not kidding, the diagrams of the pipes were hand drawn with pencil from these field surveyors and engineers and those that worked on these lines. And then those had to be captured, along with the notes going along with it. They were fantastic, beautiful documents. But
yeah.
Again, like you're saying, it was a heavy lift, a lot to go with it.
Wow. So, with your experience, let me ask this question. In taking part in this from the very beginning, from what you know now, it's kind of looking back, what would you have done differently? What would have been better if you had done X?
I think one of the things, and this is just from my perspective, is trying to get this out to all the employees. You do this on the upper management level and you get it organized and you start, saying this is how we're doing it, but to really get the people in the field and then the other, tertiary type employees to understand why and what and how, not just saying, hey, we have to do this, this is compliance, but we're doing this because this keeps the gas in the line. It keeps everybody safe, our neighbors, our customers, our employees, just making sure everyone understood that. And then what the monetary value was, what happens if you have an incident, how much does that cost and what does it do to the name of your company and cost legally and other things like that. And then again, throw the compliance in there, make sure they understand that it is mandatory, that there are fines, that things have to be done correctly and documented so that they know the importance of it. But that would be the one thing that I would go back and change a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's a big thing to take away from here is the why, communicating the why at all levels. So you get that buy-in and you get more effectiveness for the program right from the beginning. Let's change up a little bit. Let's talk about change management. So we've talked about how the pipeline changes all the time and factors affecting the pipeline. But what about change management in as far as the integrity management itself? And that's a requirement of the program as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
You bet. If you make any changes to your plan, or if your equipment changes, tools or things change, and Warren will tell you this, that PHMSA really isn't looking for a static plan. Okay, it's got to evolve and change with the needs of the operator in their system. And when that change happens, it needs, again, everything that goes along with that change, whether it's operating procedures or the way you're going to run your ILI tools, or if you're going to change how many segments you have in your pipeline or add new ones. You need to get that all documented and put in. You need to make sure that your employees are trained on those changes. And then your contractors know anything that they may need to know along those lines. But if you're making changes as far as the type of ILI you're doing, or how those records are stored, or even your welding x-rays sometimes, but that's all got to be sent out to everyone. And then on top of that, that could mean that you need to be sending reports to PHMSA saying that you're making these changes, especially if it's a substantial change to your plan or anything along those lines. And then also, if your schedule changes, if you're going from 7 years to 10 years or vice versa on these ILIs or in these risk assessments, and especially if you can't remediate something on the timeline that you've said you would, you need to let PHMSA know. Warren's smiling. You've got to let them know, and they'll only extend that 6 months. And I could be wrong on that, Warren, but that's the way I remember it. You can extend it up to 6 months, but that has to be taken serious, and you've got to get that remediation done as quickly as possible. So that's a big part of it as well. You need to let them know if you're going past that date. Again, there's charts out there talking about the differences in intrastate pipelines or interstate pipelines, whether you're crossing those state lines, and how you report on that. Again, this is such a deep part of this. We're going to talk about it more in another session. Warren and I have talked a lot about this, but there's no way we could talk about it right now.
Sure. Well, speaking of change, we talked about how the pipeline system changes, the program changes. It's expected that this program is a process and that it's expected to change, but companies change as well, and they also change hands of ownership. And so when that happens, like what does that look like, Warren? I'm sure there's major implications here.
It is, and it can be as simple as somebody selling off a section of line or one of their systems. And I always tell operators who are doing the buying or acquiring, do due diligence, especially with the new regulations now requiring verification of pipe type, test, and everything like that. Make sure they've got the records. And if this segment actually happens to be in an HCA or an MCA, getting all of that data, because all of a sudden you have another segment that's got to go into your integrity management plan, and you have to fit it in there, and then you have to look at your whole program again to see where in that process does it need to fall as far as risk. If it's a higher risk than everything else that you already own, it's got to go to the top, and and the regulators would look at that too. Like, okay, you purchased this has got ERW pipe, that's number one on the hit parade. What are you doing with it? Are you, and you can say, well, I just got this, and they're going, yeah, but what have you done to ensure that while you have it, it's safe? So they've changed in their plan, and then the operator who has sold that piece, they also go, okay, we pull that bad one out. Now what goes to number one on ours? And so that's what makes this evergreen and always changing. Again, as threats, as segments change, if they abandon something, if they abandon some pipe in place and that segment goes away, then again, their risk segments change, and that's what makes that a continual process of review and improvement.
Yeah, I could just imagine, if you didn't do that due diligence, you may come away from exchange of hands on a segment of pipeline thinking you got a great deal, but man, you got stuck with something that is so not a good deal.
If you didn't get the records and you have to verify, whatever good deal you got could be gone very quickly. And then if an operator acquires another operator, again, it's that same thing. I've got 30 segments and I've just bought 20 segments. Now I've got to filter them into this program and see where this lines out. And then all of a sudden, you've got to go in and reassess, make your threat calculations all over again and risk calculations, and then decide what goes to the top of that next inspection or assessment interval.
Makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here at a very high level. And as Lenny said, we are going to focus in on a couple of integrity management specific areas that we could talk a whole webinar on. But so let's kind of go over a high level recap of what we'd consider the top 5 takeaways from this session. Warren, you want to start us out?
You bet. Again, biggest thing is, getting that leadership buy-in to support. And if a new leader comes in, he has to be willing to make that same buy-in on this program. Just because they changed an executive out doesn't give the company an out that they don't have to have a program that's not supported. And you really want somebody who will get in there and say, okay, well, are we doing all we can, or, and have the ability to, consider, do we need somebody else in there running our integrity management program if we're not up to where we ought to be? So it's more than just, a signature and a check, is being able to say, yeah, I need somebody else in there, or we need some additional resources in there to make sure this program is where we need to be, especially depending on their size. Again, breaking down those barriers and walls. I do know there's a lot of the people my age, the tenured folks, that some of the old bulldogs are retiring now. So some of these walls are going down, but if they mentored well, there may be some new bulldogs in there holding it up, but you really want to make sure there's no silos in this information, especially when you're trying to make the single program better. And then continuously improving. Got to make sure that you're looking forward and not looking back on this. Learn from mistakes, learn from practices, but going forward, see what else is going to help you with new technology, new tools. There's just so many things that 20, 30 years ago weren't around that really provides operators that some very new information.
Thank you. And Lenny, you want to take it from there? I think number 4.
Sure. Again, on that centralized, accessible information sharing, that it really is important. And along with that, making sure that your upper management is informed the entire time, because if they go in there and see something that's changed or different and they weren't ready for it, and they're the ones signing those documents at the end of the day and being called out on it, make sure they know. But having it in one place so that if there's ever an emergency or something going on or an audit, that where that information is. Somebody might call in with an issue on a piece of pipe, and you need to know, exactly what's in the ground or above ground, either way, and how to find that data, how to share it, be able to print it, send it out, whatever you need to do, even if you're sending it to somebody's phone in the field or whatever you need to do. Just having that accessible and in one place is huge. And then on number 5, being able to retrieve those records, like we're saying, if you're merging or acquiring companies or things like Warren was saying, and I've been through this, it's a big deal. And that is a very good time. I don't mean that it's a good time, but it's a good time for things to get lost or misplaced or put in the wrong place. It's very easy, even when you're changing the guard, like Warren was saying, it's very easy to come in and say, oh, we don't need that, throw it away, but they don't know the background of that information. So you've got to make sure that those are not lost, or that you take them with you, and then you're looking at them again, like Warren was saying, if you're the purchaser, that you look at all of that data before you purchase that piece of pipe or whatever you're picking up, so you know what you're getting. But just be ready. I promise it'll pay off in the end if you're doing it correctly.
Thank you for that. So we're coming up at time in a moment, and we'd like to give you, our audience, an opportunity to submit any questions you may have for Warren and Lenny. Our team here will help filter those, but we did receive several questions from the registration form when you signed up for the class. So the first one is the integrity management program part of the proposed Class 1 gathering line regulations?
It is not. Right now, it's not. Certainly, there is some particular inclusions about MAOP, but if you're having to calculate your MAOP on one of those gathering lines, if you're not in a PIR or a class location. So if an operator does have a gathering line and he's in, again, calculating that potential influence radius, or in a class 1 or higher location, he does have to calculate the MAOP. That's the only part of the gathering regulation that would affect them.
Great answer. Here's another question. Would you consider integrity management to drive all other compliance related safety programs like damage prevention, OQ, O&M, etc.?
Actually, they're the ones that drive the information to the integrity management program. So the IM gathers it, and then whatever actions are and decisions are made from the IM team come directly from complying with all these other programs, and then again sharing that data. We can't say that enough.
How does integrity management apply to LP gas distribution systems with less than 100 customers? Right
now, there are no exceptions. Even if a service line was in a public area, there would have to be some type of DIMP or shrimp, which are the very small integrity management programs, but currently nothing in the regulations.
Thank you. How do back office roles of engineering and others assessing integrity assessment data play into OQ? The requirements for there came out, regulation came out that said that the folks that are actually viewing the ILI data and interpreting it and saying, okay, here's anomalies, this is what size they are, you need to go dig those. There's actually 3 different standards that they have to be qualified / certified for under ASNT and a couple others. But OQ was never considered
something that was put on anybody that was not on the right of way. You know, that was the very first part of the 4-part test done on the right of way. And so now if somebody were to come out onto site and make those determinations on the fly and say this has got to be done, and then it met the other 3 parts, then technically, again, it's a gray area, but technically somebody could push for, you know, that person needing to be qualified. But if they're in a desk somewhere else making calls, you know, I think it's to the person that are on the right of way, whether when they get in there to have the knowledge to say, well, he's right or not right, and here's what we'll do.
That makes sense. Here's another one. What are the trends for changes in coming years? Do you think the current administration will affect new rules, or can you tell us anything about that?
Well, I'm going to take this, and I'm going to let Lenny also, but what I saw was the trends and the changes will be the next accident or incident that hits the ground. With the internet, with media, with everything, anything that happens across this country affects these pipeline safety regulations. And I can tell you there's probably some things right now in the works just because of some of the last accidents that have occurred. Even though they're not big, each one of these does have an effect on pipeline safety. Lenny?
I just backed up Warren because that's what we've seen through the decades is every time you get a major accident or incident, you know, whether it's an apartment building burning up or a low pressure line being overpressured, you know, or even like I won't name names, but, you know, a storage field that's, you know, got a leak, you know, all of these things change the regulation more than anything. The administration can make a difference, definitely, but a lot of it's public driven. You know, when things happen, people get hurt, people die, a lot of monetary, you know, items as well. But I agree with Warren.
Yeah, and just from we can tell there's environmental concerns now driven by the administration looking at methane release, executive actions, et cetera. So I think we are seeing in real time how the current administration is affecting the industry in some regard. Here's another question. How does PSMS, or Pipeline Safety Management Systems, and the new PIPES, I guess, Act, self-executing mandates, how do they overlap and help work with DIMP? That one may require some research. I don't know.
That's a tough one.
Yeah,
I didn't
hard to read it.
I haven't looked at anything new because this so much of this was just the baselines for this. Maybe we can get that person's information and let me dig that out, and I can.
Oh, absolutely, we can do that.
And anybody else who wants to know that answer, get hold of me by my email, and I'll pass you the information on to.
And it's hard to have any regulations or anything that's not affected by PSMS right now, if there's any type of training involved or anything. But
well, I think we're getting really close here to needing to close out. So Warren and Lenny, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise and your insight. And to you, our audience, thank you for being here with us. If you have questions or concerns about your own IM plan and programs, Warren Miller and our ITS team offer a range of consulting services. I'd love to hear from you. If you're looking for a solution to help document your IM data, consider using our mobile assessment app, Onboard Assure. You can live in the same system your OQ does. We invite you to sign up for updates for further webinars. And in 2022, we're going to continue this series, and in continuation of today's discussion, our first session next year will be diving into integrity management, specifically around the reporting and change management aspects. So we're really dive deep into those two. You can visit our website at itstraining.com/regnav to be added to our mailing list for event details as they become available. And, reach out to your colleagues and share this with them if you find that others would find value here. And we appreciate you coming to our sessions and look forward to you joining us in the upcoming ones. So again, thank you for joining us and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.